Before we begin, I want to ask you something personal. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city, your state, or your country in the comments. I read every single one of them. And I'm genuinely curious, because the story I'm about to share is one of those rare moments where humanity and nature collide in the most unexpected way. This isn't just about survival, it's about something deeper. Something that questions everything we think we know about wild animals, and maybe even about ourselves. You see, at some point in our lives, we all feel alone, trapped, like no one's coming. But what if help came from the last place you'd expect? Not a person, not a machine, but a herd of wild horses. Stay with me. This isn't fiction. This happened. And if you believe in things like intuition, connection, and miracles, this story might just change the way you see the world. So take a breath. Imagine the open desert, the sun burning overhead, and a young boy tied to a tree, forgotten, left to die. But that's where everything begins to shift, because something was already watching him from afar. Something with 4 legs and a wild heart. It was the kind of heat that doesn't just burn your skin, it sinks into your bones. The air shimmered in waves over the cracked earth, and every breath felt like breathing fire. In the middle of this vast, unforgiving desert in Nevada, a boy no older than 16 was tied to the trunk of a twisted juniper tree. His wrists were raw and bleeding, bound so tightly with coarse rope that each movement felt like slicing through skin. His name was Ethan. 30 hours earlier, he had been hiking with a small group, unaware that 2 of the men had something far more sinister in mind. What began as a trip to study desert wildlife turned into something darker. Ethan had overheard their plan to poach protected species, rare birds, maybe even wild horses. And when he threatened to report them, they acted fast, brutally, silently. They tied him to that tree in the middle of nowhere, smashed his radio, poured out his water, and disappeared without a word. No one knew where he was. The sun climbed higher. His lips cracked and bled. His tongue was thick with thirst. Flies buzzed around his face, the only sign of life in an otherwise empty world. He had screamed the first night until his voice broke, but now he was too tired for hope. Too tired to fear. All he could do was endure. His thoughts began to scatter. He saw his mother's face. He remembered the way she tucked him in at night when he was a child. He thought of his dog. Then, just as his head began to slump forward in defeat, he heard something, a low, distant rhythm, steady, powerful, approaching, hoofbeats. But how could that be? Out here, alone. He lifted his swollen eyes toward the horizon. The sound grew louder, rhythmic, unmistakable. Not the harsh rumble of an engine or the light scurry of a desert fox. This was heavier, alive. Ethan tried to lift his head, but it felt like 1,000 pounds. His vision was blurred, the edges dark. The sun had punished him for too long, and he was losing the battle. But the ground trembled beneath him, just slightly, just enough. Then shapes began to emerge, like ghosts forming from the heat haze. They were moving together in harmony, with grace that didn't match their size. Horses, wild horses, 15 of them at least, moving as one, and leading them, a stallion as black as night, except for a single white mark on his front leg. His muscles rippled beneath a coat that caught the light like polished stone. His eyes, Ethan would never forget those eyes. Intelligent, watchful, like they were measuring him. Ethan's heart pounded, not from fear, he was too weak to be afraid, but from disbelief. Why were they coming closer? He wasn't food, he wasn't a threat. To wild Mustangs, humans meant danger. They usually ran, fled, disappeared into the hills. But these horses, they were slowing down, watching him, circling. The black stallion stepped forward, breaking away from the group. He lowered his head toward Ethan's boots, nostrils flaring as he sniffed. Ethan could barely move. He managed a whisper. "Go. Nothing here for you." But the stallion didn't leave. He inched closer, slowly, carefully, as if trying not to startle him, as if he knew. And in that moment, as Ethan stared into the eyes of a wild creature most humans would never even glimpse. He felt something unexpected, not fear, not relief, but recognition. Like this horse had come with a purpose, and he wasn't alone anymore. The black stallion stood still, just a few feet away now. His ears flicked forward, listening. His chest rose and fell with calm, steady breaths. Around him, the other horses formed a loose half-circle, curious but cautious. Some pawed the dry ground. A few snorted and tossed their heads uncertain, but none of them fled. Ethan blinked slowly, unsure if what he was seeing was real or just a trick played by his fading mind. His lips moved, trying to form words. Nothing came out. He tried again. "You're real," he croaked. The stallion lowered his head again, this time toward Ethan's face. The boy could feel the warmth of the animal's breath, soft and damp against his sunburnt skin. A strange calm settled over him. There was no panic, no wild instinct to flee, just presence, solid and certain. He wanted to close his eyes, to rest in that strange peace, but he forced them open. He had to see this, had to remember. Then, without warning, the stallion turned and walked a few steps away. Ethan's heart sank. Was that it? Had he imagined the connection? But then something happened that defied all logic. The stallion began pawing at the dry earth with his hoof. Again and again, dust flew. The herd shifted behind him, watching. His movements were deliberate, purposeful, not restless or random. He was digging. And then, like a miracle, the ground gave way to a shallow dip. And within seconds, a dark spot of moisture surfaced. A tiny spring, hidden beneath layers of hard earth, water. The stallion dipped his head and drank deeply, then stepped aside. Other horses approached. One by one, they drank. But they didn't stay. After sipping, they turned their gaze back to Ethan, as if they knew who needed it most. As the last horse stepped away from the spring, a mare with a soft, sandy coat, dusty like the earth itself, slowly made her way toward Ethan. Her belly was round and heavy with new life. She moved carefully, her hooves landing softly on the parched ground, as if every step mattered. Ethan's breath caught. He could barely move, but every nerve in his body was suddenly alert. She was close now. So close, he could see the shine in her eyes, the tremble in her nostrils. She didn't seem afraid. She stopped just beyond his reach. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, boy and beast, both trying to understand the impossibility of the moment. Then, in a motion so gentle and intentional it felt like a dream, the mare extended her neck. Her muzzle, still wet from the spring, hovered near Ethan's mouth. He didn't understand at first, until a single drop of water slipped from her lips and landed on his. His body responded like it had just touched fire. His tongue moved instinctively, pulling in that tiny droplet as if it were a gallon. Then another drop, and another. The mare was sharing what she had. She had brought it to him. Ethan couldn't speak. He couldn't cry. His body was too broken for tears, but something deep in his chest cracked open, not from pain, but from awe. This wild animal, this creature of instinct and survival, had crossed a line no one expected her to cross. She had approached a human, not out of fear, not out of curiosity, but with purpose, compassion. The herd watched in silence as she stepped back, then slowly returned to the group. But something had changed in their formation. Midnight, the black stallion, took one last look at Ethan, and then stepped forward. Midnight's steps were deliberate, slow, heavy, filled with something that felt almost thoughtful. He approached Ethan with the full gravity of a creature who understood the weight of the moment. There was no tension in his body, no fear, only presence. Ethan lay still, frozen not by fear but by disbelief. His body trembled, his lips cracked and bleeding, his throat too dry to form even a whisper now. But his mind, clouded as it was by pain and dehydration, was awake, fully. Midnight stopped right in front of him. For a second, he did nothing, just looked. His eyes met Ethan's again, and this time the connection wasn't imagined. Then, slowly, The great stallion bent his head down, lower than any wild horse had ever done near a human. His warm breath bathed Ethan's face, and just as the mare had done, he lowered his muzzle to the boy's mouth. Moisture touched Ethan's lips. Cool, alive. Salvation. It wasn't much, just a few precious drops clinging to the stallion's whiskers and velvet nose, but it was enough to remind Ethan what hope tasted like, what kindness felt like. Then, unbelievably, one by one, more horses came. Each of them, after drinking, stepped forward, not too close, not threatening. Each brought with them a tiny, life-saving gift, a few drops of water shared directly from their muzzles to the boy who had nothing. Ethan closed his eyes and felt it. Not just the water, but the silent understanding in their actions. These were not dumb animals acting on instinct. They were aware, present, choosing to help. He could feel life slowly re-entering his body. Not enough to run, not enough to cry for help, but enough to survive just a little longer, enough to make it to the night. And the night was coming fast. As the sun dipped lower, casting long golden shadows across the cracked earth, Ethan felt the first chill of the approaching desert night crawl over his skin. The heat that had once threatened to cook him alive was quickly giving way to a cold that could just as easily steal his last breath. He shivered, not from fear this time, but from the bite of evening wind on skin already broken. His body, dehydrated and weakened, could no longer regulate temperature. Every minute that passed drained another ounce of life from him. But the horses didn't leave. They didn't return to the hills. They didn't scatter or vanish as wild creatures should when the sun fades and predators stir. Instead, they stayed, watching, waiting. Then, the same sandy-coated mare, Ethan had started to think of her as Dusty, approached again. This time, she did something entirely unexpected. She knelt. Right there, in the dust beside him, the pregnant mare slowly folded her legs beneath her and lay down, pressing the side of her warm body gently against Ethan's. His eyes widened. Was she trying to give him warmth? Then another young mare joined her, lying on Ethan's other side, and another positioning herself at his feet. 3 horses now surrounding him, not threatening, but protecting, shielding him from the falling temperature, lending him their heat, their presence. It was as if the herd had made a decision, a collective silent pact. This boy would not die alone. Ethan's mind, teetering on the edge of consciousness, clung to this miracle. Their warmth seeped into his frozen skin. The rhythm of their breathing surrounded him. It was not just survival anymore, it was sanctuary. And in that sacred circle of warmth, Ethan's body surrendered not to death, but to the first sleep that didn't feel like an ending. That night, the desert transformed. What had once been an unforgiving furnace of heat now became a quiet expanse of bitter cold and endless stars. The winds whispered over the dunes, slicing through sagebrush and silence. But in the hollow where Ethan lay, something extraordinary was happening. The boy didn't know where one heartbeat ended and another began. All around him, the Mustangs had formed a living cocoon. Their flanks rose and fell against him like waves. He could feel their breath, their warmth, their silent loyalty. One of the young horses nudged closer in its sleep, letting out a soft, dreamy whinny. Ethan had never known anything like it. He was used to animals running from people. He had read about wild horses, how they fled from the scent of humans, how they couldn't be approached, let alone touched. But this defied all logic. And yet, here they were, not acting like wild creatures, but like sentinels, guardians. As his body softened into sleep, Ethan's mind flickered with flashes of memory. His father's stories about Native American legends, of spirit animals, of protectors from the natural world that came in times of great need. He had never believed those tales fully until now, because there was no other explanation. No ranger could have reached him in time. No hiker would have found him here, hidden so deep within the vast wilderness. But something ancient, something wise, had chosen not only to find him, but to save him. Hours passed. The wind howled. And still, the herd held formation. When Ethan stirred slightly before dawn, the first light was just beginning to kiss the horizon. He opened his eyes to see Dusty still beside him, half asleep, her breath rising in little clouds. He was still alive, and somehow they were still with him. As the first golden rays of dawn spilled across the desert floor, casting long shadows of brush and bone, Ethan stirred. His body ached, his throat burned, but something inside him felt lighter, warmer. He blinked slowly, adjusting to the light, and then he saw them. The herd was still there. Dusty rose to her feet, her movements slow but graceful. The young horses stretched and pawed at the dirt. A few wandered to the spring for another drink, but midnight, the great black stallion hadn't moved all night. He had stood guard, unmoving like a statue carved from obsidian, until now. Suddenly his ears pricked forward, his head lifted, his nostrils flared. He had sensed something. Without warning, he trotted away from the herd, climbed the nearby ridge, and stood silhouetted against the morning sky. Then came the sound, loud, piercing, and haunting. A relincho, once, then again, then a third time. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, urgent. Ethan watched, confused and amazed, as Midnight turned to face two of the younger stallions. With a toss of his head and a thump of hooves, the three took off, galloping hard and fast toward the distant horizon. Ethan didn't know where they were going, but deep in his bones, he knew why. They were going for help. A flicker of hope ignited in his chest, fragile, but real. His cracked lips twitched into the shadow of a smile. The horses had given him water, warmth, presence, and now, somehow, they were trying to give him rescue. As the sound of hooves faded into the wind, Ethan closed his eyes again, not from weakness, but from a kind of peace, because he knew Midnight was running with a purpose. And he wasn't done saving him yet. The sun had climbed higher now, inching past the jagged hills as its light spread across the open desert like a golden tide. Hours had passed. Ethan drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes lost in dreamlike visions. His body was running on borrowed time, but far in the distance, dust rose. At first, it looked like just another heat mirage. But then came the rumble. Not hooves this time, wheels, vehicles. The distant shimmer slowly took shape. Two forest ranger trucks bouncing across the uneven terrain, kicking up clouds of sand and rock as they came closer and closer. Ethan's dry, cracked eyes widened. He couldn't move, couldn't cry out, but a single tear rolled down the side of his face as the realization hit him. They were here. The lead truck screeched to a stop, and the door flew open. A voice cut through the air, loud, desperate, hopeful. "Ethan, Ethan, is that you?" It was Chris, his mentor, his friend, another ranger. He rushed forward, knife in hand, cutting the ropes from Ethan's wrists. Another ranger brought water, pressing it gently to his lips. But Ethan's gaze was fixed somewhere else. Beyond the trucks, standing at a safe distance, Midnight had returned. The stallion was watching. His coat gleamed in the sun, soaked with sweat from the long, urgent run. His flanks trembled with exertion, but his stance was tall, proud. The younger stallions stood beside him. Chris followed Ethan's gaze. Are those the ones who brought us here?" he asked, voice trembling. Ethan nodded faintly. "They didn't just find me," he whispered. "They saved me." And as the rescue team moved quickly to stabilize his condition, Midnight turned away, his mission complete, and he walked slowly, quietly, back toward the waiting herd. News travels fast in the modern world, but stories like this, they spread like wildfire. Within days of Ethan's rescue, whispers of the unbelievable began making their way through ranger stations, local news outlets, and wildlife forums. The idea was almost too much to believe. Wild Mustangs locating a stranded boy, caring for him, and, against all odds, bringing help. At first, the public response was a mix of awe and skepticism. Some dismissed it as exaggerated folklore, a dramatization of a lucky coincidence. But then came the footage. One of the rangers had captured part of the approach. 3 wild horses running straight toward the station fence, neighing, stomping, and refusing to leave until they were followed. A security camera recorded it all. And when the footage hit social media, everything changed. Millions of views, thousands of comments. Headlines that read, "Wild horses save lost teen in desert. Miracle Mustangs of Nevada. A stallion named Midnight becomes a legend." Ethan, still recovering in a quiet hospital room, was overwhelmed. He didn't feel like a miracle. He felt grateful, humbled, still processing the sacred silence of those desert nights. He spoke softly when reporters came, choosing words with care. "They didn't just act like animals," he said in one interview. "They acted like guardians." Breathe. But what touched him most wasn't the fame or attention. It was the letters. Children sent drawings of Midnight and Dusty. Survivors of trauma shared how the story gave them hope. Horse lovers wrote in to say they'd never look at their animals the same way again. And somewhere deep in Nevada's hills, Midnight roamed free, unaware that he had become a symbol, a living legend. But for Ethan, he wasn't a legend. He was the friend who saved his life. What began as an unbelievable tale was soon drawing attention from a very different kind of audience: scientists. Dr. Eleanor Wright, a renowned specialist in animal cognition, had watched the viral footage of the Mustangs several times before picking up the phone. She didn't believe in miracles, she believed in data, but what she saw challenged every assumption she held about wild equine behavior. Weeks later, she arrived in Nevada. Dr. Wright met with Ethan, the rangers, and the team that had documented the Mustangs' behavior. She reviewed drone footage, ranger notes, and first-hand accounts. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. This wasn't chance. This was choice. She called for a formal study. With the help of local wildlife agencies, researchers began observing Midnight's herd from a safe distance, logging every interaction. What they found astonished them. Patterns of empathy, cooperative behavior, intentional signals, ear movements, vocalizations, postures that were used not only within the herd, but apparently directed toward humans. It was what Dr. Wright would later call pro-social intelligence, a level of emotional and social cognition rarely, if ever, documented in wild horses. She presented her findings at a conservation summit. "This herd didn't just tolerate a human presence," she said. "They took action, shared water, gave warmth, sought help, and did it all without training, domestication, or incentive. That's not instinct, that's empathy." The room fell silent. Some experts pushed back, others leaned in, but no one could deny what the footage and the boy's survival suggested. Midnight's herd had forced the scientific community to ask a powerful question. What else are we missing about the minds of the wild? For Ethan, the answer was simple. "They knew I was in pain," he said quietly, "and they didn't look away. Just like any true friend wouldn't." Months passed. Ethan healed. His wrists, once torn by rope, faded to thin white lines. His body regained strength, but his heart, his soul, had changed in a way that no doctor could measure. He couldn't stay away. Not from the land, not from the silence, and definitely not from them. One early morning, long before the world had stirred, Ethan stood again on the edge of the high desert. This time, not as a victim, not as a boy left to die, but as someone called back. He carried nothing but a water canteen, a small GPS tracker, and a worn photograph of the herd that had saved his life. Beside him stood Dr. Wright and a small team of conservationists. They had returned not to study, but to listen, to observe, to honor. Ethan hiked toward a familiar ridge, heart pounding with memory. Dust kicked up at his feet. The wind whispered through the sagebrush like it remembered his name. And then, just beyond the rise, he saw them. Midnight stood at the crest, his black coat gleaming under the rising sun. Dusty was nearby, and beside her a young colt, one Ethan hadn't seen before, his coat a mix of gray and golden brown. Ethan froze. Would they remember him? Then Midnight stepped forward, calm and silent. He approached slowly, stopping just a few feet away. And in a moment that no one on the team would ever forget, he lowered his massive head and gently pressed his muzzle against Ethan's open palm. It was a greeting, a recognition, a beginning. Ethan whispered, voice cracking from emotion, "You came back for me, and now I've come back for you." And behind him, the herd began to gather. A circle, just like before. But this time he stood freely inside it. The wind had changed. It was subtle, like a breath being held. But Ethan felt it, just as he had felt something shift the moment Midnight first appeared out of the desert weeks ago. But now, as he stood in the heart of the herd, he understood something deeper. This was never about being rescued, it was about being chosen. The circle of Mustangs slowly closed around him, not in fear, not in defense, but in silent welcome. Dusty brushed her side gently against his leg. The young colt, curious and clumsy, nuzzled Ethan's boot before darting behind his mother. Laughter bubbled up in his chest. Honest, free, the kind of laughter only someone who's walked to the edge and come back can understand. Dr. Wright and the team watched from a respectful distance, stunned by what they were witnessing. There were no fences here, no reins, no commands, just trust, earned, not demanded. Ethan sat down in the dust. Midnight remained nearby, towering but calm, his eyes locked on Ethan's with that same unreadable intelligence. The boy took out the small leather pouch around his neck and opened it slowly. Inside was a piece of the rope that once bound his wrists. He held it up, then let it fall to the ground. The wind caught it briefly before it settled in the sand. A symbol, a goodbye, not just to the pain, but to the boy he used to be. "You turned this place into a home," he whispered, barely audible. "Not with walls, but with grace." The sun dipped lower, painting the herd in strokes of gold and fire. The valley seemed to hold its breath, and in that stillness, Ethan made a silent promise to never let the world forget what these animals were capable of. Not just survival, not just instinct, but choice, compassion, connection. As Midnight turned and led the herd into motion, Ethan didn't follow. He just stood, watching, his heart pounding, not with fear this time, but with meaning. Because they would return, and because now the story didn't belong to just him, it belonged to all of us, to anyone who's ever felt lost, to anyone who's ever needed a sign that hope still exists in wild, untamed places. The Mustangs had written it across the desert dust, and Ethan would carry it to the world. What started as a desperate struggle for survival became a story that none of us will ever forget. We met Ethan, a boy left to die, tied to a tree, alone in one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. No food, no water, no hope. And then the wild stepped in. Midnight, the black stallion with a white mark on his leg, led a herd of untamed Mustangs into a place where no wild creature was supposed to go. One by one, they defied instinct. They came closer, they watched, they acted, they brought water, they gave warmth, they stood beside him, they chose him. Not out of fear, not out of training, but out of something far more powerful, empathy. Through cold nights and scorching days, through silence and uncertainty, these animals became more than just horses. They became symbols, guardians, friends. And when the world found out, something shifted. Scientists began rethinking what we know about animal intelligence. Lawmakers began protecting more of the land. And children across the world sent letters saying one simple thing: I believe in Midnight. So here's our question to you. What do you believe in? Because this story wasn't just about horses and deserts. It was about second chances, about connection, about the wild reminding us that we're not as different as we think. If this story touched you even a little bit, do one thing right now. Comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us your biggest dream. Tell us the last time you believed in something impossible. We read every single message, and your voice matters here. Then hit the like button to help more people discover this story. And of course, subscribe to Tales with Paws. Every week we bring you emotional, real stories about animals that do the unimaginable. So don't just scroll away. Join this herd. Be part of the community that believes in the wild, in kindness, and in stories that make us cry, smile, and hope again. Because this is just the beginning.